Summit Avenue is considered to be the best preserved of the Victorian monumental boulevards across the country. This was a period that Mark Twain called the Gilded Age, went roughly from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War I. Lots of prosperity, but more importantly, people were spending money like never before. So many cities had these monumental boulevards. There's a couple different things about Summit Avenue. One is its geography. So it gives it a unique kind of twist to the monumental boulevard story, mostly because of its position on the bluff. It's also part of the reason it survives today, where many of the others don't. It's more geographically isolated than many of the monumental boulevards were. But James J. Hill built his house on what was already a premier street. He actually tore down 2 houses to build this. And he built the biggest of all the houses on Summit Avenue. You know, no competition there, right? So he's, you could say, playing the biggest game ever of King of the Mountain up here on the hill. He built his house on the bluff side of the avenue, looking out over the city. It's actually built into the hillside, so it's even bigger and more impressive on the back, the side that looks out over the city, than it is on the front, and was making a very deliberate statement. Most of the other houses on Summit Avenue are built by local architects, people like Cass Gilbert, Clarence Johnston, Reed and Stem, but James J. Hill very deliberately chose Boston architects, Boston interior decorators, and Boston materials and craftsmanship to build the largest home in Minnesota at the time. So he's making a deliberate statement, and that kind of carried through. He's now today considered to be one of the 40 wealthiest Americans of all time, according to American Heritage magazine. So it is kind of the ultimate expression of what an avenue like this is supposed to be.
James J. Hill, a very interesting fellow, born in Canada, which is now Ontario. At the age of about 18, he moves to St. Paul. This was kind of the frontier at that time. This would have been the late 1850s. He gets a job in a steamboat company because he had some accounting experience. He had originally moved to Kentucky, then he comes to St. Paul.
He worked hard. He learned the trade, starting with riverboats, and invested in some early businesses that made him successful, and then was able to pull together a group of very wealthy, very significant investors to purchase what became the Great Northern. That then, of course, took off, went across the country under his leadership, and that's the thing he's best known for.
So he researches the St. Paul line, finds out that it could be profitable. It was kind of going underwater. That's why he was looking into it. So after about 3 years worth of research and investigation, he decides he's going to buy this line. And within about 10 years, he turns the assets of that company from about $700,000 into $25 million. And he's the guy who builds the Great Northern Line from St. Paul out to Portland and Seattle. And he did really well.
A lot of other fingers in lots of different pies. He's also, by the way, was a significant art collector as well. There's a wonderful art gallery downstairs that was part of this house to house his collection. And he is today considered, as I said, one of the 40 wealthiest Americans of all time. And his legacy is, I mean, the tracks are still there. It's not the same part of our economy that it was, but the Amtrak still runs the Empire Builder line out to Seattle. So his empire is still in place in a lot of ways. There is an assumption that James J. Hill he didn't have anything to do with the cathedral. Mrs. Hill was a devout Catholic. Mary was a devout Catholic. Jim wasn't any public denomination as an adult. He never publicly aligned himself with any religious group. He did a lot of things for the Catholic Church, but did not agree with the cathedral. He thought it was too ambitious a project and did not give any money to the cathedral. And we actually have a lot of people who assume, and we've heard stories, I've even had professors tell stories that James J. Hill built the cathedral for his wife. Well, it's confused with, he actually built the St. Paul Seminary that's now part of St. Thomas. He was almost entirely his money that built that. In the dedication speech, he basically said this was for his Catholic wife. I don't know the exact words he used, but people get the two confused. But he did not agree with the cathedral, so he did not give a single penny to the cathedral. Now, Mrs. Hill did, and the children did, but James J. Hill did not.
So, yeah, he does very well. 1889, he builds his mansion in St. Paul on Summit Avenue, 36,000 square feet. And maybe the guy had just a little bit of an ego, because it's not because it was 36,000 square feet, it's because it's made out of sandstone. And sandstone is a native stone to Minnesota, but he didn't like the color of it, so he imported a lot of his stone from Massachusetts. So maybe a little bit of an ego.
He was one of the architects that worked on a lot of homes on Summit Avenue. He was trained briefly at MIT out in New York. MIT was modeling its architecture curriculum on, excuse me, I have to say this in Minnesotan, I can't speak French, L'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which was the first program that trained what we think of as an architect, with structural engineering, drawing, draftsmanship, and kind of lessons in the classics and in the basics of architecture. He had a friend of his that also went to MIT, Clarence Johnston, who also designed houses on Summit Avenue. They both started their careers in St. Paul. Cass Gilbert eventually went on to do lots of bigger and better things, like the Woolworth Building in New York City. He worked for McKim, Mead & White in New York. And then he also, later in his life, one of his last big projects was the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. So he really has a wonderful national reputation, very talented architect. One of my favorite houses that he designed on Summit Avenue is 318 Summit, which is the Leitner House. And it's a house that actually, the first images that we have of it in drawings are as a kind of classical revival, and then it ends up as a Romanesque because, of course, you do what the client wants. And it's a wonderful Romanesque house, but it shouldn't be. I mean, if you look at it, you can see it started out as a classical style house and had a Romanesque facade put on it. He also designed the house right next to that, which is a double house for two law partners, actually Leitner and his partner Young, built a double house together. There's a wonderful house of his over on the corner of Virginia and Laurel. It's a shingle-style Queen Anne that just kind of sits on the corner, and it's hidden by lots of big trees, but that's wonderful. He did the Minnesota State Capitol. I mean, every sixth grader in America knows, or in Minnesota at least, excuse me, knows Cass Gilbert because he designed the State Capitol. So, wonderfully talented architect that started his career in Minnesota and went into bigger and better things. Born here in St. Paul in an apartment, and Scott is part of a part of St. Paul society that I not so nicely refer to sometimes as the Summit Avenue wannabes. He usually lived just off of Summit Avenue. So if you couldn't quite afford to live on Summit Avenue or didn't want to spend the money to live on Summit Avenue, you could live as close as you could get and kind of have prestige by association. So Scott's family almost always lived just off the avenue. And as a result, as a child, he went to school with the Summit Avenue kids. He went to the same parties, he belonged to their clubs, he went to the same dance class over on on Grand Avenue. He went to Professor Baker's dancing school with the kids of Summit Avenue, but in a lot of ways was on the outside looking in. So he ends up with this real love-hate relationship with the kind of high society that Summit Avenue represents. As a result, he also kind of learns as an observer of society, and he also learns very early in his life to recreate himself, to reinvent himself for whatever group of people he wants to be part of. So in his stories, think about Nick Carraway looking across the bay. He's an observer in society, and he also, in his literature, is the protagonist of his stories. He always reinvents himself as a more heroic, grander form of himself as the protagonist of his stories. And that's all part of his world, his life growing up as a Summit Avenue wannabe, on the outside looking in. And there's Crest Avenue in his literature. He even refers to, he refers to Gatsby as he could have been a James J. Hill. So he takes this world that he sees and he transforms it into his literature. So there were different attitudes toward preservation at different times. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Summit Avenue was in a major decline. By the 1970s, they were actually going to tear down large parts of Summit Avenue and put in low-income housing. And it was actually those kinds of things that were happening, people coming into, or cities trying to renew themselves by what's known as urban renewal, preservationists then rising up in protest to that, organizing the preservation movement. And it was right then that Summit Avenue could have either been won or lost based on what was going to happen. And the preservationists ended up winning. People started moving in here, fixing up houses, saying we want to do this a different way. But there was a time in its life, and that's what's happened with a lot of other cities, that they didn't survive because they were poor neighborhoods and they were being renewed by urban renewal.